Thanks, Walter,
Thank you.
and thank you, and good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen, those of you based in the EMEA region, and a good morning and evening to those of you based across the globe, and a warm welcome to this session on the future of valuation with a special focus on the role of technology. My name is Nigel Sellars, and I work in the valuation standards team at the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and I've got the honour of being your panel chair for this session. I just wanted to quickly introduce my three panelists. Dr. Sanjay Nichka, Head of Data Analytics and Automated Valuation Models at Ongeo. Andrew Knight, Data Standards Lead at RICS. And last but by no means least, Sander Scheurwater, Head of Public Affairs of America, Middle East and Africa at RICS. Welcome and thank you. Over time, valuers have continued to grow in their professionalism and skill. At the same time, the valuation process itself has continued to become more and more rigorous. And valuers today are expected to be alert and take into account of new technologies, expectations, requirements from clients, as well as new and more sophisticated factors in the market in order to stay relevant. And as digital technology advances apace, so do investors' expectations and the demands of real estate valuations too. In which part this also reflects the increasing complexity of real estate transactions, increasing size of portfolios, but more importantly, investors really want to take out the full potential that technology promises them from valuation process, which could potentially make them quicker, less prone to human error, and far more sensitive to the range of evidence that is available. But without further ado, I just want to just kick off on the subject of data with you, Sanjay. The data in the property valuation sector, is this an opportunity or a threat?
You already mentioned a couple of very important keywords, which are expectations, complexity and size, speed and accuracy of valuations. And data is the basis of valuations, and we all want to provide valuations as accurate as possible and also as transparent as possible. So clearly this means that data are necessary for good valuations and necessary for improving and for moving with the time for values. So clearly this is it's not a threat, it's an opportunity, and it's even a necessity, I'd say.
Excellent, thank you. And Sandra, if I could just turn to you. You are the sort of lead author on the excellent RSS Future Valuation Report, which I highly recommend the audience downloads for free from the rics.org website. Sandra, what's your thoughts on the role of sort of data and the valuation space?
Yeah, very much agree with Sanjo. I mean, it's I would see it as an opportunity, but I think Sanjo used the right word. It's a necessity. It's what underpins or should underpin every decision. We know it can be inaccurate. We know it can be incomplete, no matter how a value is there. But the more and better data we have and is shared, the more accurate the evaluation ultimately will be. So yeah, thank you for mentioning the paper. Just briefly, indeed, in 2017, and Sanjo actually also contributed to this in a former role. We published an RICS Future of Valuations Insight paper through rics.org. It may be difficult to find, but if you just Google and you type those few words, RICS Future of Valuation, you will find it. 3 years old, which seems a very different world altogether, but I think still very valid. And I think the one big important point that I would like to mention there, which I think is also important in these type of discussions, is that that report was established with an expert group that not only comprised of valuers, but also of the clients, namely the banks and the institutional investors, which are, I think, an important part of this discussion as well, Nigel. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sander. Andrew, if I could just turn to you on the subject of data, but particularly data quality. What are the sorts of calls you're fielding from the clients that you sort of work with the RSS regarding data quality, and what are their thoughts on how data quality could potentially impact on the reliability of valuations?
Well, yes, it's a huge subject. Thank you, Nigel. I mean, I think one of you, probably Sanders, already mentioned the kind of issue of missing data. So there's the kind of the known unknowns, which is one challenge. But even when data is available, as we increasingly look at more automated and smoother processes, there's clearly challenges that so much data is either missing, or if it does exist, it's in effectively a digital form of a paper document. It's certainly not available in a structured way. It can be hard to join data sets together when you're looking at a particular asset. There are clearly questions around the kind of provenance and lineage of where some certain data sets come from. What was the kind of methodology sometimes that was used in sourcing this data? How recent is it? So, these are the kind of issues that people come back to, is that there's data that's missing, there's data that you're not sure where it came from, can you rely on it? And ultimately, perhaps, can you, put assurance on the kind of data sources that you're perhaps using? And indeed, as ever, the opaque nature, particularly in commercial real estate, where you can't necessarily get down to some of the data that you actually need. So a continual challenge, and certainly it's always going to have an effect on the reliability and certainly the assurance, where you're not entirely sure where the data is coming from and necessarily the quality of it, its methodology, as I said.
Thanks, Andrew. Just picking up on that opaqueness that you mentioned, have you got any suggestions on how the industry might overcome those opaque challenges?
Well, I suppose to some extent, it's not so much a technical issue as much as a kind of a behavioural one. I think the industry has a lot of incentives and behaviours that don't encourage the sharing of data, unlike other sectors within the capital markets and indeed other industry sectors, where sharing and aggregating data for insight is quite a common methodology. For better or for worse, we exist in a world where people feel that information asymmetry in that way, that opaqueness of data, can be an advantage. So I think it's less technical and more behavioral about understanding the benefit of sharing more data, sharing more details, still respecting commercial confidentiality and obviously data privacy from a personal perspective, but understanding the benefits which other industry sectors have gained from aggregating, sharing, and understanding the power of analysing more comprehensive data sets rather than small silos.
No, absolutely, Andrew. And there's an old value phrase, rubbish in, rubbish out. So if you have a lot of data out there, but if it's not the right provenance, as you say, that could cause some challenge down the line, particularly relied upon by valuers. Sandra, if I could just turn to you in terms of just picking up the theme of data sources and the sort of challenge that you're faced with from your clients about data sources when you're conducting your work and accessing the data, and particularly you're very market facing your role. So just discuss about that, please.
Yeah, I can only confirm that this rubbish in, rubbish out thing is true even for digitized valuations. So, and this is a situation we faced, for example, in Germany for quite a long time. as Andrew just put it, this is a behavioral issue in many jurisdictions. The opacity of valuation has a lot to do with institutions, for instance, or those who have hold of data not willing to share them. And if these data at the same time are not publicly available, which is the case in many countries actually, then it can become very difficult. And we even have the situation in some jurisdictions where the regulation is very demanding, but the data is not there at the same time. So it's a bit of a miracle how valuations have been carried out in the past sometimes. So now we have been quite successful, for instance, in Germany, putting up a scheme for lenders to share their data, and we have a scheme with about 200 lenders now, so banks of small and large ones, to share their data through a provider of digital solutions, through Ongeo, to use their data for future valuations, and this is done in an anonymized way. So the fear is always that someone else is snatching the data from the process to use them for embarking on some competitive actions, and this can be controlled using technology. So, and this has actually broken the ice very much. Now these days, that's not a taboo anymore, which it was years before. So we started this in 2017, and well, you probably know that Germany is known for good cars, but is equally known for being fairly bad when it comes to many other sides of technology, and data is one of these, and digitization. So there is this fear because something is not existent, but as soon as there is good experience with it, the ice breaks, and so these problems can actually be easily solved these days.
Excellent. And just picking up on that, do you have sort of clients who work for cross-border just across Germany, or all this data sharing, is that done within properties for German-owned, German national buildings?
Yeah, well, we have clients internationally anyway, and most of our even domestic clients, they have international business, so we automatically find ourselves in such a situation. Also, we're as on Geo, we are active in Austria, which, by the way, is very different. It's a neighboring country. They speak German also, but the culture is quite different when it comes to data. You can walk into a land registry and just purchase sales contracts of your neighbor, which is unthinkable in Germany, and also through the group. So I'm also a senior lead advisor, digital valuations in the TINSA group, which is active in 15 countries. For this, we also have the situation that, of course, there's a big group and there's an interest in using technology across borders. However, which doesn't mean that data will actually cross the borders. It's more a matter of exporting good practice and equally learning from other jurisdictions how good practice is done in countries where one would maybe not expect it.
Excellent. And just one more from me. So do you see there's a change in culture and mindset then from your clients becoming more accepting of sharing data? You finding that increasingly because they see the benefits of data sharing?
Yes, certainly, very clearly. So with this scheme of sharing data, the first ones were really difficult to convince. But the very first ones were easy because the financial supervisory authority, they were asking for certain data to be used, which in Germany would be sales prices. They were unavailable, so we had to put up a pilot to pool data of several clients. But it was really the force of the regulatory body to level the path for this to be possible. So and now we see that this is has almost become a household item for most financial suppliers for banks in the country, and it's even acknowledged in other countries as something which should be followed, because if the data are not there, the value of the data can't be capitalized on. So the original concept was always that we have good data and therefore we should not give them away. We should not put them to use. But it's a bit like having gold in your house. So you have to protect it and you have to make sure it's still there, and it just costs you money maybe. And it's the equal situation with data. The data is stored on hardware, and the hardware needs to be refreshed every so many years. And if you don't put it to use, it's pointless. If it's too old, maybe you won't need it anymore. So, and this mindset is definitely changing. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Just turning to subject of automated valuation models now, and Sandra, if I could come to you, please. You just quickly run through what actually is an AVM. Just kicking off.
Okay. Yeah. No. Thanks, Nigel. So I'm probably least of the expert here with the whole panel, but of course it was touched upon during the future of valuations paperwork. So I will just, and I put it on a sticky note here. So I will quote the definition that we've used for that paper, which we basically copy pasted from a former RICS guidance note on automated valuation models. And that describes, and I'll do this slowly, an AVM as one or more mathematical techniques to provide an estimate of value of a specified property at a specified date, accompanied by a measure of confidence in the accuracy of the result without human intervention post-initiation. So basically, in my own words, but I'm sure maybe Sanjo will want to elaborate on this a bit more because he's by far more the expert. It's a statistical model to arrive at a value with no human intervention, either than putting the data in and potentially assessing the results that come out. Just before I hand over, maybe a few additional points. I think from an RICS viewpoint, it's important to note that there is no universally agreed definition. And that is an issue because stakeholders, people who talk about this may not be referring to exactly the same thing. There are a few organizations who have defined or have produced certain standards or are working on it. So if I can just maybe briefly mention the ones that I am aware of and then hand over to the rest of the panel. So the IVSC, which is the International Valuation Standards Council. They produce the international valuation standards on which the RICS valuation standards are based. They're in the process of doing a consultation to agree on a definition of automated valuation models. And if they have one, without a doubt, RICS will take that over since our standards are very much aligned with these international standards. The other two that I'm aware of is the European AVM Alliance that has produced a European standard for what they call statistical valuation methods. Now, I know that in a former role, Sanjo actually wrote these, so I will not elaborate on that. And the other one that I'm aware of is the something called the IAAO, that's the International Association of Assessing Officers, whose members are basically government assessment officials focusing on the administration of property tax, which of course there is a valuation element. And for those who are interested, they produced in 2018, I believe, a standard on automated valuation models that provide certain principles, guidance, and best practices around both the development and the use of AVMs in valuing real estate. So there is stuff out there. There are definitions, there are even standards, but yeah, not a single global agreed on definition nor standard at this stage that I'm aware of.
Thanks, Sam. That's really helpful. So I guess, Sanjo, turning to you, so in the absence of an agreed definition of what is an AVM, multitude of standards, which I guess there is no standard, there's multiple standards, how do you provide that confidence to your clients that using an AVM is a good thing?
Yeah, well, first of all, compliments to Sander to the definition. So that's exactly what I would have said, maybe phrased a little bit differently. And you even mentioned confidence levels, which is very important, because the term of AVM is understood a bit differently depending on which part of the world we are. And as it's treated in Europe in the standards by the European AVM Alliance, there's a differentiation between AVM, which can be hedonics, AVM that can be comparable spaced, and the comparable space typically are those which are able to produce confidence levels, which are predictive measures that express the accuracy, the estimated accuracy of each individual valuation. So, as Sander already said, so there are multiple standards around, and so the question obviously is, so why is this? And this is a bit that AVMs did not originate through regulation or through something that out of traditional valuation, but originated more from the technological side of what is possible, and has over time become very much sophisticated now. So, and convincing users that this is something good exactly needs a common set of standards, a common set of definitions, and this is what the European AVM Alliance takes care of with the publication of standards, and also with having members who fulfill certain requirements. This involves, for instance, testing. This involves having tests carried out scientifically using benchmarks which are valid on all these along these lines, and it comes as its own set of standards, because this is how it's done in 8 countries so far. So in Europe, and they're probably going to be more in future. The companies associated in the European AVM Alliance, they among the market leaders in their jurisdictions, so they know what is being used and they know the technology behind this. So obviously, a bit like me being head of data analytics within OnGeo, I would know how an AVM works. So I'm therefore a person that is able to differentiate what it needs and what's maybe a good term or a good wrapping for something which is not as good as it should be. And then everything else is down to testing and to sticking to the actual terminology, because this is something which it's often found in the market using a not standardized terminology to blur a bit the fact that something is not as good as it should be, and also to make it unclear on purpose or by coincidence that an AVM has its limits, obviously, but also has huge benefits, and these should be kept apart. And the banks are responsible for choosing an AVM provider, for choosing a model. A valuer is responsible for evaluation. So whoever is using an AVM should know what is necessary to be known, and this is information which comes from the AVM providers, and who therefore know how this can be tested and what's the objective way of doing so. And the the trust is quite high, actually, probably because AVMs are obviously a cheap solution and more accurate than inferior statistical valuation methods. They are often used in circumstances where no valuation has been used before, or where an inferior valuation technique has been used, such as a house price index, for instance. There was also a publication on this one a couple of years ago on the various jurisdictions or where it's used, and this is something quite interesting. It's used a lot for these circumstances, like portfolio valuations, for instance. Something which is not very much on the mind of when someone is speaking about AVM, because it's happening not in public. So someone is valuing a portfolio, no one is talking about this apart from those who are actually doing it. It's not as prominent as value your own property. So therefore, it's in terms of numbers, it's very high. In terms of public attention, it's very small.
That's great. And of course, AVMs are great for the residential property sector. We have a lot of commoditized apartment buildings, which is great. But I guess certain circumstances, you can't necessarily pin down the exact property condition of each apartment in that portfolio. So there's some challenges around there. But speaking of challenges, can you just touch on why AVMs at the moment aren't so proliferant in the commercial space?
Yeah, well, commercial properties tend to be more complex than residential properties. So, well, a simple case, if I know one apartment in a block, I have a bit of an idea of the other apartments in the same block. At least they should share the year of build. They may not, but the typical cases they will. When it comes to what you just said, the conditions, the fitting, and so on, the AVM does not do an inspection, but the AVM can be fed with data from an inspection, so this can be covered. For commercial real estate, AVMs work as in a comparable sales manner. So you have comparables to value the subject property. And this is, well, if you're talking about availability of data for residential properties being sometimes difficult, it's even more so for commercial properties. So to value the entire commercial property is, well, it may be possible at some point in the future, but at the moment this is more an exception. However, AVM technology can be used for aspects of commercial property valuation. For instance, for estimating the rent, which is then used in a yield-based approach. So here the AVM would still come in, but then you can again choose for having a higher comparability for a specific aspect instead of the entire property. So the technology is actually used even for commercial real estate. It's just that it doesn't bring the actual result which you're after. And speaking about the future of valuations or the future of valuers, there's still a lot to do for valuers to work with these data coming out of an AVM, for instance, for estimating the rent.
Right, thank you. I'm just going to turn to, because I haven't got you involved so much just yet. So on the subject of blockchain, and you can just sort of tell the answer, what is blockchain and how's it relevant to the valuation process?
Yeah, Nigel. I mean, blockchain suffers, I think, from quite obviously the conflation in people's minds with cryptocurrencies. And I suppose if you read the press yesterday, you'll have read of the wild gyrations in the value of Bitcoin and Ethereum caused by Elon Musk and what's happening in China. I think it's worth going back to the basics of what blockchain is, because it is clearly conflated in many people's minds with cryptocurrencies, but that's only one of the ways you can use blockchain as an underlying technology. And I think sometimes it's worth using the alternative name for it, which is really a distributed ledger. It's a ledger, a record of tokens or transactions or information that's held on a number of servers. So it gives you that kind of reliability. But the key thing about all the kind of various blockchains out there is their ability to effectively provide what's called an immutable record, a record that cannot be changed, that's effectively hashed with a reference number that gives you the ability to make sure that when you read the information, you know it hasn't been changed. So one of the applications that potentially valuation could take advantage of is actually once we have these quality data sources, or we have data sources that are part of the process, particularly automated process, we would be able to access information held on a blockchain, knowing the provenance, where it came from, when it was recorded, and knowing that there was no danger of that information actually being changed. Because blockchain itself, it's not an algorithm, it's not a methodology of actually generating a valuation, but it could well be a way of sharing and aggregating data in a very secured way that everybody could trust that source and that quality. Another area that's kind of somewhat tangential to valuation is the fact that blockchain can be used as a store of value. And so there may well be situations where once a property's been valued and is being traded, that the ownership of that property can be held in a fractional way using blockchain. But I think it's worth understanding that the blockchain is not this kind of silver bullet, to use the English phrase, that can solve various problems. It is essentially a ledger, a database that's distributed over a number of servers that can be used to track information and make sure it's not changed, or if there is an update, that you have a clear audit trail of how that information has been changed. But it does have its limits, and it's not, it's not an application that will, I think, necessarily revolutionize valuation, but it could provide a way of aggregating data, a way of getting trusted data that's perhaps shared more easily. But it's not in itself, I think, going to revolutionize valuation. But please, Sandra, anybody have a contrary view to that? But I think there is a great deal of misunderstanding about blockchain in that sense. There are plenty of use cases where it is being used outside of cryptocurrencies. If you think of funding in terms of trade finance, it's being used very usefully to track pharmaceuticals, legal pharmaceuticals, dare I say it, and obviously it's being used in things like shipping for bills of lading, and also there's a great use case where it's used to track olive oil to make sure that it's the genuine article. So it has many useful applications, but I think we need to get beyond the hype and just see it as another tool that we have in the digital arsenal to manage data securely, to understand its provenance and lineage and quality.
Thanks, Sandra. I never thought of preparing my evening meals tonight when I'm using my olive oil. I'll be thinking of blockchain. So that's something I'll be taking away from this. Sandra or Sandra, do you have anything to come in on the subjects of blockchain? So any sort of observations or comments? Please do, Sandra.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
No, I fully agree with Andrew, what you said, and in particular making the differentiation between blockchain as the distributed ledger instead of a cadastral reference, for instance, or blockchain as a special purpose vehicle to trade shares of a property. And so these are two very distinct worlds, and if it comes to having it as a distributed ledger, as a land register, I guess this is very handy, but this is far away from where we are in many countries, because these data in many countries are top secret. So it's inconceivable to share them openly. They could still be shared in a closed group, but I don't see this coming too soon. It's interesting though. And the other thing is, breaking something down into shares and trading it just moves the valuation process from a property valuation towards something like a corporate valuation or valuation of shares. So it's a different idea behind this then.
Thanks, and thank you. And Sandra, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, all very well explained from the, what blockchain can do, and from a ledger viewpoint and the data. I think the one other thing that was identified at the time of writing of the future of valuation report was not only how the data can be stored and then used, it's also that a valuation report can be put in a blockchain. And at the time of writing, there were a few banks in Hong Kong that were working together through a blockchain system, putting their valuation reports, sharing it through a blockchain system, which of course could have as an effect that less valuations would be asked for, because before each bank, asked for its own one. But of course, if you share it, then you increase the transparency, and it could lead to less valuations being needed. So just as an addition.
Nigel, if I could
Yes,
perhaps
of course.
butt in there, I suppose that the challenge there, I mean, Sander's very right to bring that forward, that you could indeed store information on the blockchain and share it, but you're then back to that, as Nigel will know well, that issue of assurance, that who have you extended assurance to? It's all very well sharing physically a valuation, but you can't necessarily extend the assurance to other third parties unless that was part of the terms of engagement. So once again, you get down to that kind of almost that interesting issue where the kind of technical ability bumps into the reality of assurance and how valuations are used in the marketplace. So once again, blockchain can be a useful way of facilitating certain functions, but in of itself, it doesn't actually in many ways do anything differently from a well-secured SQL database that might be shared within a number of participants who want to have a shared repository of data. And also to some extent, the fractionalization piece, where I think, as Sandro said, where you can end up looking at almost a capital market valuation of a listed vehicle effectively that's wrapped around a single asset. That's already been done with the IPSX exchange in the UK, where you effectively have a special purpose vehicle for a particular asset that is available to be both initially traded and then they have a secondary market. So that can still be done without blockchain. You can still fractionalize real estate in that way without the technology.
Thanks, Andrew. Just conscious there's just a minute left. So if I could just go around sort of the virtual room and ask for any sort of concluding thoughts or observations as to the future of valuation. And if I could start with you, Son, perhaps if I could just maybe cheekily ask you to talk about the role of regulation, if at all, because that's something we've not touched on this past half hour. Thank you.
Were you asking first? Sorry.
Yes. So your concluding thoughts on the future
Okay,
valuation.
mine,
You
yeah,
can
so,
incorporate
yeah,
the role of regulation in that, just for you. Thanks.
Yeah. No, I think the key thing for me with regulation is that it can both lag the market, but it will also ultimately drive the market, steer the market. In the EU, I think, if you look at the EU and what they're trying to do now with the Green Deal, the EU taxonomy, the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, it will drive valuations in a certain way, value in a certain way. AVMs are not part of that yet, but for example, there is a directive called the EU Mortgage Credit Directive that's up for revision, and we are in discussion with the European Commission. In the 2015, whatever it was, directive, AVMs are not included. I'm not saying for a fact that they will be included this time, but it's certainly being looked at by the European Commission on how to handle that. On the future, I think the future of valuations is very bright. There will be a role to determine the value one shape of the others, and the role of the valuer in there, which of course is also relevant for us, can be very bright. Without a doubt, valuations will become increasingly digitized with AVMs and other tools as well. I think, and it was also the conclusion of the report, that the valuer will need to take on more of an advisory role, which they will be very well equipped to take. And in two short sentences, I think then valuers, there will be more interesting work, but potentially for less valuers. Like there are now also less travel agents, but those travel agents who are still in existence do much more interesting work and make some tailor-made advice to their clients. And when I presented on this, my final point, for valuers to be aware and to prepare for this, I used a quote from a 1920s book from Ernest Hemingway, where the main character was asked, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer of the character was, well, in two ways. First, gradually, and then suddenly. There. Thank you.
Positive note, Sander. Thank you for that. So that's great summation. Sandra, just very quickly, 10, 20 seconds, please, on your thoughts.
Yes, well, I think we're all a bit biased when it comes to regulation. So valuations are made because of regulation in many circumstances. So we need regulation, and but at the same time it can draw us back also. So I equally agree with Sander. So there is a future for valuations, and as with all these examples, travel agents, cars, and horses, and everything shows that it will not die out. And if one embraces technology, this is a bit of an insurance to actually stay on.
Yeah, and Andrew, last word with you.
Yeah, I would say that as technology becomes increasingly used, regulation will still need to be there. We still need to govern and assure AI, machine learning, as these kind of approaches to valuation get even more potentially kind of black box-like. There has to be a role in the real world for assurance and regulation around these kind of models, so that we protect the public and any other users of valuation.
Excellent. So it just leaves me to say thank you to the panelists for joining us today, and thank you, the audience, for joining us for this session. I hope you found it informative, challenging, and of interest, as I have. And over to you, Walter, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.